Good morning and welcome to the episode of the Ad Drop Podcast. Well, you know it is time. It's time to get smarter. You know him, you love him. The legend of simultaneously El Segundo, California and Cal State Northridge, while still being the managing editor of Last Word on College Football, Tony Siracusa. Tony, what's going on, my man?
Hey, Biggs, it is snowing here in Charlotte as you and I record this. It's freaking me out more than just a little bit because I'm a Southern California boy. As you know, you can well imagine, even in the snow, I am in my Southern California gear. I am wearing a long sleeve t-shirt with a hooded sweatshirt and shorts because you can't get rid of the Southern California boy out of me. And that's just the way we dressed when it got cold. You still wear the shorts, you just throw a sweatshirt over it and call it good. So that's the attire even while it's snowing outside my office window right here.
Now, you mentioned the discussion of regions, and one of the things that
Mhm.
regions and coaching, do you think that there's that drastic kind of disparity between ex college coach from or coaching in a certain region versus another coach coaching somewhere else? Like as far as if we compare coaches on the West Coast versus coaches in the Mid-Atlantic.
I think there probably used to be, probably back when I was growing up, watching college football as the dinosaurs were roaming the earth. There probably used to be a little bit more, so I don't think there really is anymore. You know what? I think there probably still is for college basketball, because you're talking about this, you see a lot more high post offense in this region of the country, or you see the big man dominating down low in this part of the country. These guys run a guard oriented offense. I think it's different with college football. I think that one, it's a little harder to keep that regionalization when you're talking about, 22 players on the field at any given play. Um, and I think also because you look at just the changes in the game that have kind of moved from region to region. Here's an example. The Big Ten used to always be the region that, it was 3 yards in a cloud of dust, right? In the Bo Schembechler, Woody Hayes era. We look at who just won the national championship, and it was Ohio State with a wide open offense with skill position players that were elite at the receiver position, that the running game came second. You look at teams that, and part of that is because coaches have moved around. Part of it is because, frankly, in the last 10 years, schools have moved around. And they have brought a new level of creativity. They've brought differences in the way they play to different conferences. Um, if you're in the Big Ten, you're going to play Oregon, who's going to run. Dan Lanning's going to run a wide open offense at you every single week, even though it's a Midwestern Big Ten schedule. So I think that when college football was much more regionalized, you had the Southwest Conference. Man, who remembers the Southwest Conference, right? Arkansas and then everyone else in Texas, right? As the old Southwest Conference. Um, the Big Eight used to love running the triple option offense or the veer, with Oklahoma and guys like Jamel Holloway at quarterback. When the game was much more regionalized, I think that, yeah, there were styles of play that you would see depending upon what you were watching. But I think as players moved, because everything is on TV now, so you're, as a coach, you're not selling, hey, you can, be on the local ABC station for the Saturday game and your parents can see it. Now everything's on cable and the networks and streaming. So players have moved around, coaches have moved around accordingly. And I think that it's now more of a team style instead of a conference or regional style.
I know that even if you look just from a personality standpoint, when you look at coaches from a certain area who go to completely different area, I'll use uh Ed Orgeron,
Hmm.
who coached everywhere, but he was a Louisiana guy, Cajun guy,
Hmm.
going
Hmm.
to Southern California.
Hmm.
And the prevailing thought, not about Ed, but in general, that there are certain fan bases who will take, who will, I guess, be more attracted to coaches of their team if they're not local, but from that same region. Like I've
Sure.
noticed that
Sure.
some people, some diehard Alabama fans are with a little bit of pushback for Caleb DeBoer because he's a upper
He's not
Midwest
one of
guy.
them. Yeah, he's not
Right.
one of them. Yeah. But and I get that, and I think that there's a little bit of an old school fan base that goes with that kind of thinking. Um, but in terms of the style of football, I think, look, really, the best coaches adapt to the kind of talent they have. They want to run a certain style of offense, but they have to be able to adjust based on the kind of talent they have. That is why Chip Kelly was a failure at UCLA because he never made those adjustments based on what talent was available to him. It's why he succeeded at Ohio State as the offensive coordinator because he didn't have to go out and recruit, he inherited a level of talent that well suited the kind of offense that he liked to run, a very fast paced spread offense. But I think the best ones have to change and adapt to whatever they can get recruiting wise. And then, of course, as you and I know, the recruiting world has completely been turned upside down with, the transfer portal and the extended availability of junior college players and things like that. It's completely changed the recruiting landscape. So I think look, I mean, in the past, we've talked about Dave Clawson and the slow mesh offense that he ran at Wake Forest. It was an adaptive measure to the talent he had, which was a bunch of 2 and 3 star recruits who could get into school there, one, and who were willing to be at the smallest school in the Power Five conferences, and have that kind of life in a state where A, it's a basketball state first and foremost, and two, or B, you're still going to be behind Duke and North Carolina and even NC State when it comes to the attention factor that you're going to get. So this was an adaptation, much like what they do at Army or Navy. There are there are specific players you can't recruit because there are size and weight limitations and requirements that go with the service academies. And so you adapt your offense to what you can get there. It's what Paul Johnson used to do at Georgia Tech. You adapt to what you have. The landscape for recruiting at Wake Forest has changed because the admissions department gave some allowances to Jake Dickert, the new coach, that Dave Clawson wasn't getting. And it's not scandalous in any way. This happens at every school when you get a new coach. You're going to get a little bit of leeway that other coaches had not gotten. So he had, what I think, 22 players come in through the transfer portal, which is nearly double what Clawson had in the previous 3 years of the portal. But it's going to be a completely different offense because he's going to adapt to what he has talent wise, which is different than what Clawson had.
I look at it, and speaking of Coach Dick, I know that you sat down and there was a publishing of part one. When you look
Hmm.
at his approach and his kind of demeanor, do
Hmm.
you see that excitement starting to permeate the program?
Yeah, I think, you know what? With the fan base at Wake Forest, there's a lot of wait and see. They don't know Jake Dickert. They really don't. His first head coaching job, his only head coaching job prior to this was at Washington State. And he was a defensive coordinator starting in 2020 and got the head coaching job on an interim basis when Nick Rolovich was fired in 2021 for failing to adhere to COVID policies for state employees. And then after the 2021 season, Dickert got the job without the interim tag for 3 seasons. But let's face it, who out in Winston-Salem or in the Triad area of North Carolina is following Washington State football, especially as the Pac-12 collapsed under its own weight, and Washington State and Oregon State were all that was left. Who out here was watching, a game that started at 10:30 East Coast time with the Cougars against whomever from the Mountain West? They weren't. So they don't really know Dickert. Um, this was the first one-on-one sit down with the media that he has done since, well, he did his press conference, when he got introduced, but this was the first one-on-one sit down he's done with the media. And we had him for quite a while, probably about an hour, well, 2 hours before you and I sat down to record this show. Look, he's a different guy than Clausen, just by any measure. Clausen was very professorial, very measured in what he said, but the things he did say, he said with a purpose. Dickert is 15, maybe 16 years younger than Clausen. It's his second head coaching job, but it's in a Power Four conference where the future of the Pac-12 is still in limbo as they add new schools, and you never know what's around the corner with the Pac-12, and still having no TV contract. So this is a big step for him. He's got no ties to the mid-Atlantic, southeastern part of the country. So getting to know the head coaches for the high schools out here, getting to know the talent out here, it's a lot of work. He has not been back to Pullman. His family is still in Pullman. So his kids can finish out the school year back there. He has not been back since he got the job in mid-December. His family has come out to Winston-Salem a couple of times. He's not been back because he's looking at it as just 24/7 all the way through spring camp right now. And so, there's going to be a lot of difference in the offense. We've seen the end of the slow mesh. I confirmed that with him, and he chuckled and he said, look, Dave Clawson did a great job creating something that was needed to be able to win at Wake Forest. And he was very complimentary of Clawson, but it's clear we've seen the end of it. He joked that we could make a tombstone and put it outside the practice field. Herein lies the slow mesh offense. It's going to be different. It's going to be a little bit more fast paced. He's going to run what he calls a power spread offense. I think that right now it's just a lack of familiarity with the Wake Forest fan base and him. That was one of the questions I asked. I said, what does the Wake Forest fan base not know about Jake Dickert that would go a long way in educating them about who and what you are? And his answer was interesting. He said, I was never meant to be here. And he didn't mean Wake Forest. He meant as a D1 head coach in college football. I mean, he went to a school. You probably know this place, being the Wisconsinite that you are. He went to Kohler High School.
Yep. That is, as we speak, I can look out of my window. Kohler is 10 minutes away.
Okay, that's where he went, graduating class of 27, according to him, when he graduated from there. His intent was to be a high school math teacher and coach high school football. But he decided he wasn't done playing. He wound up at a D3, Wisconsin Stevens Point, and wound up as a grad assistant there after he graduated, and wound up getting an offer to be a grad assistant at North Dakota State, where he met Craig Bohl, who, of course, just retired this last year after a long stint at Wyoming. And Bohl became his mentor over the years and helped grow him as a coach. And And so it's a different story. I think that the more he's out in the media and doing public things, I think the fan base will take to the liking. I think that, look, a lot of the fan base really like Clawson, and for all the right reasons. Clawson preached the virtues of Wake Forest, of getting a degree from Wake Forest, an elite academic university. Um, but they also got tired of the 4-8 seasons the last 2 years. So I think the change comes at a good time for the program. Um, you don't hear Dickert saying, "Hey, we're going to win 8 games." He said, I don't know what we're going to do the first year, but we're going to put our stamp on it." In the portal, out of all the players he got out of the portal, 7 of them came from Washington State. He also got some high school kids who had been committed to Washington State and instead chose to follow him cross country out to North Carolina. So he's got a bunch of his old staff. Pretty typical stuff in this day and age of when a coach moves, there's a whole process of movement with him. Um, so we'll see. I wouldn't say there's excitement yet. I would say there's a wait and see.
Now, mentioning coaching and coaching,
Mhm,
in the news,
mhm.
DJ Durkin, the Alabama defense coordinator, I wrote an article today about how the pressure on him is immense now that with being the second highest paid defensive coordinator next behind Jim Knowles at Penn State, that there's no more 5 loss seasons. There's no more Birmingham Bowl appearances. And
Right.
when I look at Dirk, and I can't help to think of Jordan McNair, his former player who at Maryland who passed away, and
Yep.
there was an issue when being only 47 years old. Do you think what happened at Maryland will keep Durkin from a head coaching job?
Yeah. At least at a high end Power 4 school. I do. I absolutely do. Because you've got to, if you're the athletic director and you bring him in for an interview, the school president wants to know how you can justify this. And look, there were lawsuits, there's always litigation when there's a death, but there were legitimate questions about how he was running training camp and somebody basically dying from heat stroke and dehydration. And how does that ever happen when you've got, medical staff at practice every day? And, this isn't when you and I grew up when you've just got a trainer who, gives you some ice water. You've got equipment at the facilities to test your medical standing, how you are physically at any given moment. Um, I remember back, going back to Wake Forest a couple of years ago when Sam Hartman was working out and felt some pain in his right shoulder that he recognized that having gone through it before in high school. And they ran immediate tests on him right there on campus. They ran body scans and ultrasounds on him right there. And he had a blood clot in his neck, which, if not immediately resolved, would have killed him. And he'd gone through it in high school. And so you have these abilities, and you've had them even when Durkin was the head coach at Maryland. And the fact that it wasn't used, it wasn't utilized, is going to sit with any school president because the head football coach is the face of your athletic department in most schools. Um, we've talked about how the athletic department, the sports departments, are the front porch to your house. The house is the university as a whole. Athletics helps provide tremendous revenue for the university. There are a lot of studies that show that successful athletic departments create an increase in enrollment applications for a university. Um, so, with that front porch being what it is, your football coach is often the face of that front porch. And I don't see how you make Durkin that. I think Durkin is a career assistant, offensive coordinator, whatever the case may be going forward. And be happy with it. Be happy you're still coaching at all.
That's my thought. He makes the most out. But when I look at him and I look at the fact that Auburn paid that much money, they have put all their chips on Hugh Freeze and DJ Durkin to write this. And if they don't, this might go down as one of the most noticeable over investments of resources to little return on interest that you will ever see.
Yeah, and Auburn has a history of some really bad ones over the last 10 to 15 years. And for this one to rank up at the top, that really says a lot.
Exactly. Now, this week we had, or we're having the Big Ten SEC kind of a summit down in New Orleans. And
Sure.
was I wrong to, or did I get this wrong where they each, well, there's a thought that each conference wants four teams in the playoff?
Yeah, they're there, and you notice to further emphasize your introduction of that, it is only the SEC and the Big Ten. The ACC and the Big 12 aren't there. They weren't invited to these meetings. It's the athletic directors and the school presidents or chancellors that are in New Orleans. Um, and they're there to discuss a couple of topics, but first and foremost is the playoff system. Once the current playoff contract ends, which this upcoming season will be the final year of the current contract. Really, you can expect the Big Ten and the SEC to literally own the process going forward. And they're talking about creating a system. First of all, the expansion from 12 to 16 teams is pretty much a foregone conclusion. The the SEC and the Big Ten are looking to guarantee four teams each in automatically into that 16. Then you would have two for the ACC, two for the Big 12, two group of five, and then the other remaining couple of them filled in randomly by at-large teams. And looking for that to be an actual mandate in the new playoff format. Look, they're preaching to their own choir. Of course, the Big Ten chancellors and athletic directors want it. Of course, the SEC wants it. The question is, do they have the juice to pull that through? The answer is probably so, because who's making the most money in college football right now from the TV networks and for the TV networks? It's those two conferences. So does that give them the juice? Yeah, it probably does. Do I like it? No. The predetermining automatic qualifiers beyond a conference champion, I don't like it. Because what if the SEC is having a down year? It does happen. I know it's, unearthly to think about that if you're an SEC fan, but it does happen. Why should you get four teams in if that fourth team is nothing better than an 8-4 team? Now, part of what will allegedly happen if they do this, there's got to be balance between the Big Ten and the SEC. So a couple of things are going to happen if this does come to fruition, and nothing's going to be decided this week. There will be no formal, granting of these rights this week. But they will come up with thoughts and plans and move it to another meeting I think the next one's in late April. There will be pretty much guaranteed games between the Big Ten and SEC every year. That's not to say every SEC team is going to play every Big Ten team. They don't have the same amount of teams in the conferences. But there will be these high-end games between the two power conferences every year. The other is, in order to do that, it will force the SEC to go to 9 conference games. The Big Ten is currently at 9 conference games. So is the Big 12. The SEC and ACC are at 8. It will force them to go to 9 conference games. So it will eliminate one out of conference game, and then one will be dedicated for at least half of the teams to a Big Ten opponent each year, which will give them one more that they'll get to, two more that they'll get to fill in for a total of three out of conference games.
I'm glad you mentioned the word high end because no one wants to see Rutgers play Missouri
No, goodness, no.
in anything.
Maryland versus Arkansas, not going to
Oh,
set the TV world on fire. No,
oh, that is
no, but you'll see, Michigan against Ole Miss or whatever. You'll see more of those games. There won't be a formality of who plays whom, but there will be an agreement that there will be a certain amount of those games every year.
does this forge sort of an alliance, albeit
Mhm.
informed between the ACC and the Big 12?
You would think so. I'm not really confident in Jim Phillips' ability as the commissioner of the ACC to pull off that kind of alliance. Um, you know, Brett Yormark, the Big 12 commissioner, would have to be the driving force, and Yormark, of course, is going to look out for himself first and foremost. I've talked to administrators at schools within the ACC who've told me they would rather have Yormark as their commissioner than Phillips. He's too placid. He's too quiet, whereas Yormark knows how to rally the troops when there's trouble at the door. Um, and so, yeah, theoretically, yeah, but I think what you're going to see more is the ACC and Big 12 complaining that they're being left out of the decisions. I think that is what's going to happen first, other than rather than saying, "Hey, you guys did this, so we'll do this." I think it's more you're leaving us out, and we're gonna throw a bit of a temper tantrum about it, because there's going to be unity needed elsewhere. One of the other discussions happening this week in New Orleans is taking the Power Four and removing it from the NCAA. Now there are different ways this could happen. For years, there's been a movement to move college football away from the NCAA and let college football manage itself with its own commissioner. We certainly have heard names like Nick Saban, Barry Alvarez, Dave Clawson thrown around as people who could be the commissioner. We know that Clawson would be interested in it because he's flat out told me so if it ever came to that. Um, but that would be one idea. The other idea is to move everything from from the Power Four into its own managerial world. The thing with doing it for football is you will hear people in the football world say our challenges are different than those of the other sports. The calendar with the postseason, the conference championship games, the bowl games, signing day, the start of the transfer portal window, all happening in December. These things are crazy, and we have our own problems that only we can fix. But we need to be put in a position where we don't have to worry about how it impacts the women's swimming team or how it impacts, the men's volleyball program. So there is that. But then, so they're going to need the Big Ten and SEC are going to need some alliance with the ACC and the Big 12 in order to make either one of those work, whether it's just football or all sports. You're going to need them on board at some point. So I don't think the ACC and 12 really have it within them to create their own alliance, and certainly financially, they don't have the bullets in the chamber to be able to do it.
It's interesting because when we look at how basketball is, I wonder if schools that in the in the Big 12 and ACC would they not take it out on the basketball teams of the Big 10 slash SEC, but I kind of wonder when it comes to other sports how that relationship is going to be dealt with. And you mentioned the commissioner role. I can see Greg Sankey trying to throw his name at the front of the line.
And he will get a lot of resistance, I'm going to tell you, because it's an assumption. Greg Sankey is the most powerful guy in sports. Greg Sankey and Tony Petitti, the Big Ten commissioner, are two dramatically different people. Sankey came up in the sports administration life. Uh, he was at smaller schools. He was at the D2 level and the FCS level, and has been a long-term administrator. So that when Slive left as the commissioner of the SEC, Sankey, there was no question that Greg Sankey was the heir apparent. Tony Petitti is kind of what we see in the new world of college sports management. He was a TV executive. I mean, yeah, he played D3 baseball, I believe. But he came to this job as a TV executive. Brett Yormark has got a lot of media experience before he took over the Big 12 from Bob Bowlesby. And they're dramatically different in what their thought process is. Both of them have the same job in that they are theoretically to answer to the school presidents and chancellors. That's who their constituency is. But I think anyone who really pays any attention to the granular part of what goes on behind the curtains knows Greg Sankey runs the SEC. The school presidents and commission and chancellors do not. Greg Sankey runs them. They don't run Sankey. There's a little bit more of a partnership with Petitti and the Big Ten schools. So I think that there would be a loud disapproval from the ACC, the Big 12, and even the Big Ten at the idea of Sankey being the commissioner.
I look at the two just from things you hear and kind of things you observe where TD, like you said, being a media guy, he seems like he's a lot more media savvy, a lot
Mm-hmm.
more measured in his approach and his words, where Sankey just he wants to be on every show. He loves the camera and
He does.
it's grating because he knows that he runs the most powerful
Yeah,
conference in all of college football, and it seemed like his goal is to pretty much instead of trying to build where you have a consensus playoff, he wants to crush the competition, even though all these
sure.
conferences should be working in concert.
Sure. Look, he's very self-aware. He knows who he is. He knows he's the most powerful man in college sports right now. It's funny because it was actually Slive that created the SEC network, but Sankey gets credit for the growth and explosion of it. So he's going to be on Paul Feinbaum's show, every month. He's going to be on ESPN's College Game Day multiple times every season. He's going to be on all of these other college football shows. And yeah, I mean, I think it would be insincere for him to say he doesn't like it. Of course he does, because it keeps him at the forefront of the conversation when it comes to college sports. Look, it's when we talk about whatever leverage the other conferences have, who's the top conference in college basketball right now? It's not the ACC. It is very much the SEC. When you look at the list of teams that are 500 in conference play because they're all beating each other up, it tells you how good the conference is right now, that they go outside the conference and they took the ACC to the woodshed back in November and December when it was ACC and SEC matchups. And there's no question they're better than the Big 12 and the Big 10 right now. So whatever leverage the ACC had with regard to other sports, it's been diminished. The SEC has grown in so many other things besides football. And then again, like I said before, you've got the financials. All of the SEC or all the ACC schools will make about $40 million this year. That's half of what Rutgers is going to make. It's half of what Maryland is going to make in the Big Ten. It's half of what most of the SEC schools are going to make. So there's really, and you look at the Big 12, they have a glorified they have a glorified Pac-12 type of contract, that you get what you get because it's what we've got, and all the schools are making in the $35 million range. There is not a lot of leverage beyond the Power Two conferences, and Sankey dominates that relationship.
You mentioned basketball. If you look at the top 10, of
Hmm.
those teams in the top 10, five are SEC teams,
Yep,
one is a Big East team, three are ACC teams. Sorry, three are Big 12 teams, one
there
is
you
an
go.
ACC team. And
Yeah,
I'm like, yeah, it's bad. It's whew. And
yeah.
Sankey, but it's just it'll be interesting to see if the worm turns and the power ever shifted in non-football sports away from the SEC,
So
what his level of humility will be like.
please, if you thought you had too much of Greg Sankey during football season, just wait till he's showing up at the Elite Eight and Final Four, and you get all the cutaway shots of Sankey sitting there. Look, an SEC basketball team hasn't actually won the national championship since I'm going to say 2012, 2013, somewhere around there. But the fact is, they're having a very, very good year. So, yeah, if you thought you saw too much of Sankey before, just wait till he's showing up at the College Baseball World Series and the Softball World Series and the Final Four, and he's on TV for all of those in addition to the football stuff.
Yeah, he definitely has that affect of he's going to be omnipresent if his
Hmm.
conferences are winning, and like I
Yeah,
said, the law averages will dictate a down year every now and then. But
you would think so. But the
getting
que-
back,
but then here's the question, and we don't know the answer. It's completely rhetorical. When does it happen within the context of the cycle we're talking about? The change in the college football playoffs, the new TV contracts, which for both the SEC and the Big Ten will come up in 3 years, new TV contract negotiations, an alignment to, readjust all of college sports with regards to the NCAA, the context within the content. When does the downturn in the Greg Sankey world happen compared to when these other events are happening? And we have no way of knowing. We're just gonna have to wait and see. But it's something to keep an eye out on.
the developments in the ACC case with
Hmm.
Florida State and Clemson and their
Hmm.
quote unquote New Deal. How do those two aspects or all those two things
Sure.
interact and kind of coexist?
Well, there was big headlines 3, 4 weeks ago that ESPN and the ACC reached an agreement on a contract extension, which wasn't true. That's not what it was. The contract was always written to go through 2036, which is when the grant of rights expires for all the schools that presumably has them tied to the ACC, and the ACC owning their broadcast rights through 2036. What was the real topic of the matter was that ESPN had an opt-out window, which expired on February 1st of this year. They had to announce by that time that they were going to opt out of the contract, which would carry them then through the 2027 academic year, and then they would be out. Presumably, it would end the ACC network. Frankly, presumably, it would partially at least end the ACC as a conference. Um, they opted not to exercise their opt out. So that is the reality. It wasn't a contract extension. The contract was always written through 2036. Now, it could have an impact on the lawsuits with Florida State and with Clemson, and here's why. When all the schools in the conference signed an extension of the grant of rights back in 2016 to carry it through 2036. It was written in the grant of rights, which, I've got a copy of right here in my file drawer here, with all the signature pages from all the schools. It was written that this was to coincide with the extension of the ESPN contract, which back in 2016 was getting extended. The schools were not told in writing on the grant of rights that ESPN had an opt-out clause that could let them out early. They were never told that in writing in the grant of rights. That was a big part of the evidence in the lawsuits, big part of the discovery in the lawsuits with the schools as the plaintiffs. So the one in Pickens County, South Carolina, with Clemson as the plaintiff, and the one in Leon County, Florida, with Florida State as the plaintiff. That has now been taken out of the mix, theoretically. They still weren't told, was it a breach of contract on the part of the ACC? You would have a hard time arguing that it's relevant at this point because the ESPN is staying. So does it really matter at this point? Where we are with the lawsuits is at the appellate stage of the most preliminary parts of the trial. We're not even close to actual trial dates. Florida State you have in Mecklenburg County, North Carolina, where the ACC sued Florida State and Clemson for breach of contract. Both schools filed for a motion to dismiss based on jurisdictional issues that the case should not be heard in North Carolina. Florida State actually included the claim of sovereign immunity because it is a state university, a state property that they cannot be sued in another state. The Judge Lewis Bledsoe in North Carolina, denied those motions. Bledsoe has since retired, ironically enough, at the end of January. But because those cases were heard in what's called the special contract court, which is for complex contracts, they can skip the other appeals processes and the other appellate courts, and they can go straight to the state Supreme Court in North Carolina, which they have done and they have filed. It is not, as you and I sit here recording this, it's not on the dockets yet for this spring for the state Supreme Court. And there is a potential holdup because, well, one, the state Supreme Court doesn't put stuff on the docket 6 months ahead of time like the U.S. Supreme Court does. But also because there's an empty seat on the state Supreme Court. The state Supreme Court justices in North Carolina are put there by election. And there was a winner for a vacant seat in the November election, but the justice who lost continues to appeal the election, wanting 60,000 ballots thrown out. He doesn't want them thrown out where it pertains to all the other elections, the presidential election or the governor election, just as it pertains to his election, and wants those thrown out. And he keeps finding courts in North Carolina willing to hear his case. So it's really pumped the brakes on the appellate process in North Carolina. Likewise, if you go down to Florida, the ACC is appealing to the state Supreme Court. They had a motion to dismiss, saying the proper jurisdiction was in the state of North Carolina because that's where the ACC headquarters are, and because they were the first to file. In other words, they got their filing in before Florida State did. Judge John Cooper down there, who's wacky as can be in the courtroom, he denied it, and he refused to issue a stay. That means he refused to halt all the proceedings pending the appeals process. In North Carolina, there's a halt on everything until the appeal gets to the Supreme Court. In South Carolina, they issued a stay. There's a stoppage to everything pending the appeals. Cooper didn't do that. He thought everything should go forward no matter what. The ACC appealed that to the First District Court of Appeals in Florida, and they lost. So all of the discovery, all of the work, all of the filings continue to go on in the state of Florida for that case. And the ACC has filed an appeal with the state Supreme Court. Ironically, one of the attorneys for the ACC is, is an attorney named Alan Lawson, who actually used to be a state Supreme Court justice in the state of Florida. He actually used to sit on the bench that he's about to go argue in front of. So no date has been set for that. The filing is relatively new. So, but theoretically, mid to late spring, we should start to see some activity again in the higher level courts.
It is interesting, and it's gonna be where if the cases go FSU's and Clemson's way,
Mhm.
do the other school athletic directors, actually more of the school, I guess the school presidents and chancellors,
Mhm.
do they immediately ask for Jim Phillips's resignation?
Probably. But I think before they do that, they'll hit the doors to find their own way out of the ACC. Also, if Florida State and Clemson prevail in court, and based on where we are in the appeals process, we're probably lawyers that I talked to in the Florida State ACC case in North Carolina, both sides that I've spoken with estimate we're probably a year to year and a half away from an actual trial because there will be other motions and those will get appealed and so on and so forth. Um, but yeah, Phillips won't be around. North Carolina, the University of North Carolina will hit the exit door, probably so. The University of Virginia, University of Miami, there'll be a wholesale wash out of the conference.
And I guess looking back, history will not look kindly upon Jim Phillips and his tenure as
Mm-mm.
being the man who effectively killed the conference.
Right. Well, and look, the 20-year long grant of rights is absurd. It's absurd that schools signed off on it, but they signed off on it thinking they were going to have ESPN as a partner for the duration of it. And it turned out that it turns out now that it will be true. Back when they signed it, possibly not. Look, Phillips did it. And well, it wasn't even Phillips. Phillips inherited it. John Swofford was the commissioner of the ACC when it was done, and Phillips inherited this. But he has sworn an allegiance to it without any real desire to renegotiate any terms. They do some financial tweaking every now and again. If you make a postseason bowl game, we're not going to do even revenue sharing throughout the conference. If you made the bowl game, you will get a disproportionate share before we filter down the money to everybody else in the conference. And that's fine. But we're talking about that moves a couple $1 million here and there when you're 35 to 40 million dollars behind every school in the Big Ten and the SEC.
That is pretty brutal. Now, last question for you.
Mhm.
As a Lakers fan, actually, let me preface this. As a Knicks fan in the 1990s, I had to deal with watching the Bulls prevent Patrick Ewing from winning any sort of championships. When he
Sure.
got the championship, they were embarrassed. Now,
Sure.
flip it kind of similarly. As a Laker fan in the 1980s, were the Lakers the ones who held the Rockets more down or the Trailblazers back?
Wow. Boy, it's a good question. You had the one year, and I'm not going to remember which year it was. I'm going to say like 81 or 82 when the Rockets beat the Lakers. Ralph Sampson hitting a shot at the buzzer, which knocked the Lakers out of the playoffs. Um, and just a horrific year. So the Rockets had their shot. Certainly Ralph Sampson and Hakeem. The Blazers. See, I look at the Blazers more having their run in the '90s, being the best that they were in the post Bill Walton era, post Maurice Cheeks era. Look at them in the '90s with Drexler and Duckworth and and guys like that. Um, so, the Lakers really dominated the Western Conference for most of the 80s. Like I said, you had Houston get in there, but none of them had the complete team that the Lakers had in the 80s. Look, the entire starting five for most of those years. I mean, there were changes in the starting five, but the starting five for most of those is in the Pro Basketball Hall of Fame or the Basketball Hall of Fame. Same with the Celtics. Their starting five all those years they went head to head with the Lakers. That starting five is in the Hall of Fame. I mean, that's what other teams you're going to look at that can profess that, right? I mean, Houston had good teams, they had good players. The Blazers had good teams, they had good players. But where else are you going to find your entire starting lineup is in the Hall of Fame?
True. Back then, I guess last question. Back then, were there any teams that weren't the Lakers or the Celtics or any of the top teams that were just fun to watch? For me, it was the Denver Nuggets. Alex English,
Alex
Pat
English,
Lever,
sure. Yep.
Dan Issel, and
Dan
Kiki
is.
VanDeWeghe. They were fun.
Sure. No, they were absolutely fun. And I know you said that was the last question, but you took me to a name where I gotta have a quick story.
All
Do I have
right, I'm
time to
here
have a
for it.
quick story?
Of course.
Kiki VanDeWeghe, whose real name was Ernest Maurice VanDeWeghe III. Now, there's a reason you go by Kiki if your name is Ernest Maurice VanDeWeghe III. A product of UCLA, played on their team that played against Louisville for the national championship back in 1980. Had that vacated because of NCAA issues. But there's a story. Kiki VanDeWeghe's dad was obviously Ernest Maurice VanDeWeghe II. He played pro basketball for the Knicks for a period of time, but it was a journeyman, short-term journeyman in the NBA. Then became a doctor, became an orthopedist, was the first doctor to perform one of the 7 arthroscopic surgeries I've had on my 2 knees. When I was 17 years old playing high school basketball, it was still relatively new. The Curlin Job Clinic with Frank Job and Bob Curlin, who were team doctors for the Lakers and the Rams, had created the concept. And Dr. Ernie, as I called him back then, was the first one. I've had 7 arthroscopic surgeries on my 2 knees over the years. He was the first one. Kiki VanDeWeghe's dad. Now, Kiki VanDeWeghe's uncle played in the NFL for several years. Um, Kiki VanDeWeghe had siblings. Tanya played, and I may have this backwards, so forgive me if I do. She was a swimmer, a world-class swimmer at UCLA, and then decided she wanted to play volleyball, made the Olympic volleyball team while playing for USC. She transferred schools, went to USC, made the Olympic volleyball team. Kiki had a brother who played on the PGA Tour for a short period of time. He was an All-American golfer at San Diego State. And then, like I said, Dr. Ernie's brother played in the NFL. There was only one person in the immediate family who was not an athlete. That was mom. All she did with her life was she was a former Miss America. So, she was the slackard in the family, in the VanDeWeghe family. And then, of course, Kiki's niece, Coco VanDeWeghe, is on the professional women's tennis circuit right now, has been for several years. My daughter has an autographed racket from her. So there is the VanDeWeghe family, and there is my story about my connection to Kiki VanDeWeghe and the family.
Kiki VanDeWeghe's nephew, whose name is Hugh, is a freshman
Yep,
at Cal.
yep, yep.
And as an executive, apparently Kiki VanDeWeghe, he was the one who helped Dirk Nowitzki
Hmm.
develop his game.
Yep.
he drafted Carmelo Anthony,
Mm-hmm. The
and
Nuggets.
he
Yep.
somehow convinced the Nets to make Mikhail Prokhorov sell the team. Actually,
Wow.
they kind of he had it out with, and eventually, Prokhorov, who was one of the worst owners in history of the league, sold the team.
Yeah. So there's my Kiki VanDeWeghe story.
That
And
is
Dr.
awesome.
Ernie.
Dr. Ernie, how
Dr.
can
Ernie.
people interact with you on social media, and what's coming up on Last Words?
Sure. You go to Last Word on Sports and you click on the college football link. We've got an Instagram page as well. We've got a Facebook page. We're on Twitter at Last Word on CFB. We're also on Blue Sky with the same tag. I am at Tony Bruin on both Twitter and Blue Sky. Um, as you and I talk, we have just posted the first part of the interview with Jake Dickert, the new Wake Forest coach. We also have a look at the quarterback room for Ohio State now that they've got to get some work in from the youngsters coming up. We've got to look at Clemson and some of the position breakdowns headed into spring camp in a couple of weeks as well. So, and then later on in the week, we will have part two of the interview with Dickert, where you know me, I don't want to just talk X's and O's. I want to talk big picture stuff. And I've been fortunate, having Dave Clawson my first 3 seasons here, who was always more than willing to do it. And it turns out so is Dickert, who's got some interesting thoughts on the college football playoff system, on college sports pulling away from the NCAA. He's got a remedy which I have not heard from anybody else yet. He's got a thought process about how to do that that I had not heard from anyone else. So we will have that later on in the week as well.
Hello, Tony. Thank you so much for joining us on
All right, man. Be well.